Good afternoon, everybody. It's time to resume the hearings into the South London Waste Plan, and we're going on to our discussion of matter 5. So, as a starter for this, I'd like the boroughs, please, to comment on whether the plan sets out effective mechanisms for its implementation and monitoring, with reference to any proposed modifications and how they would ensure soundness in these regards.
Thank you, sir. So the boroughs will monitor and review the effectiveness of the plan in meeting its strategic objectives, policies, and targets through the monitoring and contingency table in Appendix 1. In order to ensure the plan is flexible and can deal with changing circumstances, the boroughs have identified a number of possible risks and constraints to delivery and have set out contingency plans to address these risks. In our statement, we've set out proposed modifications that seek to address the issues raised in matter 5 and set out in Appendix 1 of our statement.
Thank you. Would you like to take us through particularly where those modifications have been proposed? So I've got the Annex 1 open now. So if there's anything you want to draw our attention to particularly, please.
Thank you. So just to clarify, we have renamed the proposed indicators, grouped them. So, for example, where it states indicator 1, we've now got indicator 1.1, just to clarify that point. Yeah, in relation to indicator 1.1, formerly known as 1, we've just clarified some of the wording in relation to the target there. We've also made reference to the relevant London Plan policy, SI8 there. In relation to the monitoring, we've just provided more detail about how this indicator, the household, commercial and industrial waste indicator, is going to be interrogated. We're going to use the Environment Agency's waste data interrogator. In relation to assessing target annually, well, we're just clarifying in that second sentence that we'll be reviewing any extant planning permissions, and just for note, we're also proposing to clarify what extant planning permissions mean in the glossary as well. And in addition, we'll monitor cross-boundary waste movements through the duty to cooperate report, and this will be reported in the AMR. In relation to management actions regarding compensatory provision not delivered, we've also added that we'll undertake or commission updated assessments of site availability as necessary, either as part of the existing development plan, related activities, or as a specific piece of work.
Add something to that statement. From the schedule showing changes to the monitoring framework, you can see from policy WP 6 onwards, there's a whole load of brand new indicators that were put forward because we recognised there wasn't enough focus on the environmental impacts of the plan as a whole. So the origin of those indicators stems very much from the sustainability appraisal process, where in actually trying to define the criteria for assessing these sites and the policies, that generated quite a detailed list of indicators, which are the things we would need to measure to check whether our policies and sites were indeed having a beneficial impact compared to the alternatives. And so you'll see from the schedule under policy W6 onwards, which deals with sustainable design and construction of waste facilities, there's a lot of kind of red underlined new text, which recognises it's not just a question of monitoring waste management trends and the apportionment and all of these waste management fundamental indicators, but also looking at the impacts of the plan and actually going a lot further than the previous plan in attempting to monitor that.
Can I just ask a couple of questions in relation to this morning's discussions? We talked about this morning some issues about air quality, and we talked a little bit about monitoring. We've talked about the relationship between industrial land supply and the need for waste management facilities. We talked about cross-boundary waste movements. So if I were to say to you, well, all those are potentially monitoring issues, where would I look for in this monitoring schedule to reassure me from what we said this morning that, first of all, you're taking on board issues about air quality. Secondly, you're aware of the impact or otherwise the plan might have on other development plans in the plan area, particularly regarding industrial land supply, because what I can't see is that dichotomy being monitored about whether or not the plan's potentially stifling unnecessarily or otherwise industrial land supply. And I'd like to be reassured when we talked about policy this morning, WP3, about what does that mean in terms of in, out, cross-boundary movements. How are we monitoring that? So it's kind of, I'm playing devil's advocate because of people probably listening who were here this morning. But some of the things we raised in those discussions were relevant to the monitoring of those issues. So it's kind of just me saying to you, reassure me that those matters are adequately covered by the monitoring regime, so that the people who raised those matters this morning can be reassured or otherwise that those concerns will be monitored on an annual basis, reported on an annual basis, and actions taken if not. And I'll kind of give you a starting for 10. I'm struggling to see where I can see anything about industrial land supply, if that's an issue, and how retaining that capacity is still ongoingly needed when there might be other tensions in other development plans that need to be thought about as to how does this plan relate to those, and indeed does this plan thwart those attempts inadvertently to maintain an appropriate supply of industrial land.
Not sure how best to answer that. I think that's something we're going to have to discuss amongst ourselves, if that's okay, and come back to you once we've had further discussions to try and address that.
That's no problem. It's not being pedantic. It's really just saying, look, there were lots of things raised this morning, whereby some of the answers to those dilemmas rests in monitoring, and there's some things raised that I can't quite see how we would know if that was the case, because I can't quite see it in the monitoring plan. Nonetheless, there were valid arguments made this morning about those issues. So I think I put you on the spot there to say, well, show me where it is then. Some of it I don't think it is there. Some of it I think it is. I know where I can find the compensatory capacity issues. I know I can. But some of the issues about monitoring some of those environmental impacts, whether it's you or something else, some of those about monitoring land balance, I'm not so sure that's clear in my mind, looking at the monitoring schedule.
I would just say that that I think most of the issues that you mentioned. They are mentioned in our monitoring framework, but the question is, how well do we actually do it going forward? And I think for something like air quality in particular, of course, we have an air quality monitoring network and plenty of monitoring sites across the South London area. And that doesn't get you all that far apart from just an expression of what the general problem is of air quality in South London. And obviously waste has an impact on that, but it's not only waste, it's everything else which impacts air quality. And I think actually something we will be talking about when we go away to discuss this is how far can we realistically be kind of monitoring the performance of individual sites as they get planning permission, as they get implemented, bearing in mind that there is an Environment Agency regime anyway, in sometimes in parallel, and that leads to lots of questions about duplication, actually which things should we be monitoring. We can certainly be trying to make sure that we are keeping on top of enforcement and implementation. But actually, while that probably merits a mention as part of our monitoring framework, it's a separate question from whether the plan is any good. It really, it's a question of enforcing our adopted policies, and each of the local planning authorities making sure that they can pick that up whenever there's a breach of the condition or whatever. But some of the more general issues about cross-boundary movements and loss of sites and compensatory sites, that's well capable of being monitored by the AMR. I don't think there are many issues that you mentioned that couldn't be addressed in future monitoring reports.
I appreciate, that there's some aspects of community concerns that are not relevant to the planning regime, but nonetheless, this is an opportunity through a planning document that people look at, and perhaps they don't have the expertise to understand who monitors what. And kind of my question is, well, if I pick this plan up, would I understand the limitations of the monitoring regime? Would I understand the responsibilities of another organisation in monitoring waste management sites? Or would I come away with the impression that, well, the council's not monitoring this? I understand what you're saying. What I'm really saying is that there are some aspects of the concerns that can't be monitored by this plan. But nonetheless, should there be something just to say in the plan that the Environment Agency has a role in this? There are other elements of the council has a role in this. There are other monitoring regimes and reports that pick up on these issues that's not relevant to where this plan works. But just so there's some understanding that there are additional frameworks, that this isn't the only show in town. There are lots of other frameworks that can do a lot of that environmental monitoring as well. But then the issue is, how does some of that reflect in your annual monitoring reports? And I know some boroughs have tried to incorporate some aspects of the Environment Agency's outputs in their monitoring reports, just to give people that rounded kind of appraisal as to what's happening annually in terms of waste management sites. Something for you to think about, but it's kind of relevant to what the discussions came up this morning, and no doubt they will come up tomorrow. It's saying, well, you've told me all these things, but how do I know? How do I know you're going to check it? I'm sure each borough has an enforcement policy somewhere along the line, and some enforcement regime somewhere that is a public document that people can be alerted to if they know where to look or know it exists. And it's just how far the plan goes in recognising there's some things a plan can do, but there's, particularly in waste management, there's lots of other inputs and bodies responsible for various aspects of management. These are what they are, and we may or may not report them. You might need to think about how you do that, but at least it's giving people there's flavour that there's something else out there that's secondary, not secondary, parallel to this, but we can only deal with these matters. But nonetheless, we are aware of them, they are reported. I think you understand what I'm trying to say there is, if I pick the plan up, do I understand how a waste management site is going to be monitored? Because I'm not a waste expert, member of the community, I've never come across this before. It's the first document that's passed through my eyes in terms of waste management. How do I know? I can be reassured that this is the case. And I appreciate it's not all land use planning, but nonetheless, it's kind of the first attempt to tell me what's really happening. And some of the concerns that's been raised this morning, some are relevant to this document, some are not, but nonetheless, indirectly planning issues, but usually only planning issues that you can address when it comes to plan application stage. But nonetheless, they are monitored by somebody. So it's just to have a think about, but those particular issues in particular reassure me that the tensions raised this morning can be monitored in the monitoring schedule. And that industrial land supply one, that real dichotomy, which I think we're going to get back into again tomorrow, I just can't see that. So what we've not linked in, I think, and I've looked at some of the text, we've talked about this plan, we've talked about the London plan, but we've not talked about other development plans, each of their own boroughs' local plans, because unless you're monitoring the effectiveness against those as well, then we're missing something somewhere, particularly when it comes to competing land use issues. That's all I need to say. So it's just something to have a think about, just whether or not, you know, that kind of me challenging you, is that monitoring regime robust to give the reassurance that we inferred this morning? Does it do that?
Would be feasible to include a little note, at least in the appendix, where the indicating framework is set out, at least a note to try to sum up where the planning regime ends and the licensing kind of regime begins. And it's not always that clear cut, and there are many debates about how far can planning go through planning obligations to do things which the EA regime ought to be enforcing. But I do agree personally, although we haven't discussed this further at this stage, that we could add something in there to explain that boundary line, because it isn't clear as at the moment. There's nothing in the plan about waste licensing at all. So
that in fairness is really helpful. It's you could take a purist approach and says, well, this is a planning document, doesn't need to touch on these things, but waste planning is very different. Lots of the impacts are often not monitored by the plan. They can't be. They're monitored by the waste license, but there's an expectation of the community that you're the council, it's your plan, why aren't you doing something about it? So I think it's not often you would say this in other plans, but this is one where the perhaps is need to just pitch what the plan can do and what the plan can't do, because there is an expectation that the plan can do everything and it can't. But nonetheless, there are other regimes that can do some of the community concerns that just need to be addressed. So it's me, it's kind of just taking a purist planning it off and saying, well, actually, how user-friendly is this document? It's not a soundness matter. I'm not going to get into all that kind of stuff. It's how does a person in your community pick this document up and understand it, understand its relationship with other things they probably haven't got a clue about or wouldn't know where to look for, but at least it can lead her into that and just explain what its limitations are, rather than its expectations that can't be delivered. Nothing more than that.
Thank you, sir. I think, yeah, we understand the point on it's a sensible suggestion. So I think we can go away, have a look at that, and we can come up with some modifications to make that clear and strengthen that table further.
Thank you. Can I take you to paragraph 1.2 of the Matter 5 statement? So there, the final sentence of that paragraph says the 4 partner boroughs have an ongoing duty to monitor the implementation of Section 106 agreements through their respective AMRs. And then it leads into the proposed modification to paragraph 5.54. So there's a new bullet point there, and it says analysing waste planning permissions and compliance with conditions. So my question really is whether that bullet should also include a reference to analysing the implementation of the Section 106 agreements as well as planning conditions, seeing as that appears to be something that's already information that's already gathered in AMRs. So I wondered if you had any views on that, Mr. Witter.
I think that makes perfect sense, and I don't think it would cause any real problem in including that, because it's just a logical consequence of kind of making that change. But having said that, I think there is a wider issue which has been discussed within the planning team on this plan, that there are some practical kind of resource issues involved in terms of having a guarantee that in all cases we will always be able to monitor every single breach of a planning condition for all time within each of the 4 boroughs. And I think kind of that reality has to be acknowledged. I'm not sure it will be acknowledged in the plan necessarily, but certainly if there are clear breaches of conditions, or where a planning obligation hasn't been carried out, that ideally needs to be monitored by each of the 4 boroughs. And in my view, it should, that change should be in the plan. But it's just how we can all recognise that it practically speaking, it may not always be possible. I mean, there could be breaches that are not picked up, but it's hard to say how that would be reflected in any modification to the plan itself.
That's probably the point I'm making about enforcement policy. You'll have an enforcement policy, no doubt, that explains how you will investigate matters for all development, not just minerals and waste development, in this case waste development, but it's probably, the linkage is probably reflected in the enforcement policy. So people sat around this table are not going to be monitoring environmental issues on site. It'll be the respective council's enforcement officers recognising resource issues. The way they do that will probably be set out in some enforcement policy somewhere. So whether or not the linkage is only simply about in accordance with the council's enforcement policy or relevant council borough's enforcement policy is maybe the linkage that people might want to see to understand the regime that does enforcement and monitors enforcement matters, that links into this site. Because I'm sure you don't have specialist waste enforcement officers and specialist waste site inspection people. It will fall into the general enforcement regime. But you probably do have an enforcement policy or something there that says how you deal with monitoring arrangements on lots of different sites, not just waste sites. And there's some recognition that there are limitations to that, and there are matters of prioritization within that framework as well. So to address the point whether or not it's a linkage to in accordance with each of your borough's enforcement policies is something that you might want to think about.
I think it should be pointed out, though, that it's the first time in my knowledge that this sort of plan, certainly in South London, has even acknowledged that angle of monitoring. And it certainly wasn't present in the previous plan. I don't even think it was necessarily raised specifically, and actually creating the link between the actual implementation of planning permissions for waste facilities on particular sites, and actually whether it is actually kind of following our planning policies, and actually whether it's being enforced. It has implications on resources, but I'm personally pleased that we got that recognition in there, because it does create that link. I mean, rather than just saying, well, we acknowledge air quality, for example, as a problem, and it's there in our sustainability appraisal in a general sense. Here is the problem, but till now there's been absolutely no link really, until actually having this extra wording and a more comprehensive monitoring framework that really does acknowledge that it's not just sort of monitoring waste management performance against the apportionment, but it's looking at the impacts, but also recognizing that the importance that planning permissions are in accordance with the policies of the plan, and also implemented and enforced. And again, we run up against the issue of resources, but it wouldn't be the fault of the plan necessarily. The wording's there to try to do that.
don't think I need to respond on that matter. I think it's me just saying that we recognise resource issues. We all have resource issues. But clearly, if you're putting something in a plan to monitor, you need to have an appropriate framework to monitor it. You can't just say, well, we put it in there. It's a good idea. We think we'll monitor it, but we might not monitor it. So it's kind of, I recognise what you're saying. And it might be the first time it's in the plan, but hey, oh, that's progress. Yippee, we've finally got something that kind of recognises some of the environmental credentials that you're purporting to promote. So it comes back to the point I probably made earlier. That I recognise proportionality in the way that you can do things, but that applies to every aspect of environmental monitoring that the council does on many other aspects of development. And there will be something out there where that proportionality is recognised in what you can and can't do in other policies that's not necessarily within this plan. So it's just ensuring that you are aware of those, and the limitations of what you're alluding to is reflected in the way the council generally deals with enforcement through some other policy somewhere. It might need to be referred to in the plan, but it's not a soundness matter in that sense. It is a soundness matter if you ain't going to monitor the things you've said in here. You don't produce any monitoring report. Well, that's another issue, but we're not going to get into that stage. I know we're not. But it's just making sure we've got that kind of proportionality reflected, and where does the monitoring some of these environmental impacts lie? And some of them will, there is a pecking order of some seriousness, and I appreciate that when we have resource constraints, but nonetheless, the regime is there somewhere along the line. It's just making sure we've alerted to the regime.
I think, so going back to your previous points, I think we can have a look at enforcement. But I mean, we personally don't have an enforcement policy in a development plan document as such. And we did propose one previously, but it didn't survive. But we do have enforcement protocols and sort of council policy as opposed to planning policy on enforcement. So we could look at those linkages and see what the other boroughs have in place and see what we could do to strengthen it in that respect.
I suppose it is what is meant by analysing compliance with conditions, and then my suggestion in terms of implementation of Section 106 agreements. So I wouldn't anticipate that you're analysing every single condition and every single one of Section 106. I think it essentially have to be a reactive process, wouldn't it, in terms of where you've got clear evidence that there might be breaches of those. But it's a question of how that can be clarified, when you're talking about monitoring and implementation.
Slightly related to that point, it is feasible for the AMR to look at the EA data on the breaches of the waste licensing at the very least, which I know it is actually duplicating efforts, but it does provide relevant it's relevant information if people are concerned about air pollution in the vicinity of a waste site, and it would flag up a problem if there were sites which were fully compliant with the waste licensing, but somehow there was a planning generated obligation as well, which wasn't being met, and that would still need to be reported on. But there is actually quite a lot that can be done to screen through the major sites, the larger sites, to report on sites where there may have been problems or even local concerns, and focus the attention on those sites, because it is true that it would be too onerous to monitor every single condition attached to every planning application, every aspect of a Section 106. But I think perhaps we could go away and talk about how we can come up with a form of wording as part of the monitoring framework, which kind of clarifies the realistic extent to which we are committed to monitoring implementation as well as just monitoring, waste management data.
just one thing that's just struck me, and it's again just comes back to some of the things we discussed this morning. If I were to say, how does the monitoring framework demonstrate progress with meeting the circular economy? If I were to say, how does it demonstrate progress with co-location facilities? If I were to say, how does it show me that the best use of land is being maximized by intensification? Where can I find the kind of outputs that will tell me that those aspirations in the plan are being met through the monitoring regime? I don't want you to give me the answer. I think that the question is they probably aren't there. But clearly we've made some bold statements in some of the objectives here about circular economy. We know there's a serious issue about land supply within London, therefore you need to maximise as much as you possibly can the use of sites, and therefore that means that there's probably interest here in intensification, and technology will change that over time. But there's also this issue about co-location. Now we get the best bang for our bucks from waste management, and I'm not so sure if I read the monitoring regime, I could pick out and say, well, actually this plan is driving towards that, and I can see there is progress year on year about addressing some of those. So we've kind of aligned the monitoring regime to the policies, which I can understand that, there's nothing wrong with that. But in doing that, we've probably missed a little bit about some of the objectives that will come out from application of the policies, but just by monitoring the policy alone ain't going to give you that answer. So we might just want to think about some of those issues, which are very important to what you set out at the start of the plan. Can I pick up and see that the journey is being made on those matters?
It's actually the case that when we were rewriting and expanding that monitoring framework, the starting point wasn't the individual policies, because there are so many cross-cutting issues. In fact, apart from the ones which we already had in the draft plan, all the new ones or the modified ones, the starting point was from looking at all of the wider objectives to do with waste management and circular economy and zero carbon and sustainable transport, all those issues. And actually once they've been identified, that then for ease of reference, they were then almost shoehorned back under the policy heading. So it wasn't just going through the policies and just blindly, just looking at the policy, because really the world out there doesn't really operate in terms of policies. I mean, that there are environmental problems or trends which need to be interpreted. But I think the answers, I think the answers will depend on the quality of the AMR which gets produced, because it's not just what you monitor. Clearly, you need to take it all together and come up with an interpretation. This information shows that we are moving towards a more circular economy or towards zero carbon, or we have a particular problem in this area of air pollution. And I don't think it's possible just to look at the monitoring framework, which just sets out what we intend to monitor and what the targets are, and also contingency plans, what we would do if we weren't meeting the targets. I think it's asking a little bit too much for that on its own to provide the answers, because really the answers come once all the information is in, and we try to annually report on that and actually try to bring it all together in that report and look at the wider issues, and not just waste management issues, but London plan issues, local issues.
I hear what you're saying, but I do think that, in the way, and there's 1,001 ways of doing it, there's no wrong and there's no right and there's no best way. No, there isn't. It's whatever suits. But some of the visions in the plan that are clearly stated at the start of the plan, if I'm being honest, I would struggle to see that we're addressing those visions from the monitoring framework. It might well be when you write that, you pick that up. But from the monitoring framework, I really couldn't tell whether or not you are progressing towards circular economy. I really couldn't tell whether we're promoting co-locational activities, because the framework is not the framework that's in front of us is not saying that's what you're going to just monitor. And I really couldn't tell whether we're maximising land use in terms of that sense by looking at some of those throughputs. Dead easy things to monitor. You're monitoring them anyway, but what you're not doing is overtly putting them out in a framework. I'm not asking you to do anything else. And it is a soundness issue because I'm struggling to see how you can, how the vision, direction of travel that you want the plan to go is reflected in its monitoring framework, because there are those little gaps, but you're monitoring those things anyway. So it's not hard to make the linkage. So what I'm really saying is it's just be sure that the monitoring framework is not only relevant to the policies, and I understand the reasons for doing that, but it's also ensuring that the vision and objectives of the plan are also, you can see that those are being delivered in those annual monitoring reports. It's not another layer of monitoring, you're already doing it. It's just the way you interpret that to clearly set out that, yes, you know, we are then, all of these monitoring regimes, plus perhaps X, Y, Z, will ensure that we can show that the vision objectives of the plan over the plan period, there is progress towards.
I think it would be useful to have an indication of which are the issues in the vision and objectives which are missing from the monitoring framework, because I'm slightly surprised because I'm not too aware of too many issues which are mentioned in the vision and objectives which are not covered by the monitoring framework.
It comes back to my earlier question, Mr. Witter. Point me in the monitoring framework where you can tell me the progress of the plan about co-location, circular economy and intensification. It's not a criticism in that sense, so don't take that personally. It's me saying these are bold objectives you set out. Just make sure that the objectives you set out, you can reflect they're being delivered by the monitoring regime. And it's a simple task. It's not, but some of these issues are matters that were raised by people indirectly this morning. So we just need to be sure that we are monitoring some of the direction of travel, particularly when it comes to things like safeguarded land and employment land supply, because you could have a situation where the plan is actually thwarting other plans because it's so restrictive in terms of not allowing waste sites for anything else. And you've still got compensation, you've got plenty of capacity, that it's actually having an indirect effect on throttling back waste employment land opportunity. Something unintentionally, but it's just, unless you start to monitor that and just see, well, actually, do we need to review or do something different here in one of this plan or another plan, then we've got some longer term problems. So it's not a big issue, but it's me just saying that we've kind of aligned it to the policies. We just need to do a sense check that the alignment is also reflecting the strategic direction of the plan as well. And that's what I think, there's just that sense check needs to just be taken. It's not for me to go through and say, well, it's this one, it's this one, it's this one. It's me saying to you, there could be a soundness issue here if we haven't got our ducks lined up. It's not onerous, you're monitoring it anyway, really indirectly. It's just that you're not overtly explaining how you're getting from the vision to monitoring progress with that vision. And then there is that gap, and I think there genuinely is a gap about the relationship with other plans, because we've kind of focused, probably we all do this, too much on the London plan and forgot our own plans. And this plan sits with those as well. So there's something there about ensuring this plan's not thwarting what individual boroughs are trying to achieve, because we've kind of got blindsided by that, by having to concentrate all our efforts of conformity to the London plan, that perhaps we've not thought, it's still there in your mind, I know it is, but we've kind of just lost a little bit. Actually, we just need to just keep an eye on what it's doing for our own strategic plans as well, and our own development plan regime in individual boroughs as well. So there's something in there, and the critical one, as it came out this morning, is employment land supply.
One thing to note is that in the sustainability appraisal, there was a compatibility analysis that was quite detailed, which actually cross-checked all of the strategic objectives and the vision of the emerging plan against all of the sustainability criteria which were developed through the scoping process. So scoping all of the objectives that we could we could possibly think of that should be had regard to by the plan. So we did actually carry out the analysis of trying to make that link between the objectives of the plan itself and wider environmental sustainability objectives, which clearly covers social, economic, and environmental and equalities issues. That those checks were carried out, and also many of the indicators were helped to be formulated from taking a step back and actually looking at the wider problems that the plan needs to address. So I think the underlying connections have been made, but I think we need to accept the point that that link needs to be made clearer in the plan itself. Quite a few of the early policies are strategic in nature anyway, and in some cases the objectives really are a more general expression of those.
I think we understand the thrust of what you're saying, sir, and I think it's probably from my perspective something that's quite straightforward to address. So I don't think we've got any issues there. We can go away, look at that, and come up with a way forward on that one.
Well, thank you. That concludes the questions that we had on this matter. So if we could just go into the housekeeping session for this evening, just to run through the potential modifications that we've discussed. So if have you been keeping a running log of these, Mr. James?
I will have a go if others can help me on this. Some of them are pedantic. So there was in the duty to cooperate section, there was a typo about Greenwich that was to be corrected.
I don't think that needs to be corrected. That was just a clarification point. Yeah.
Okay. Then how can I frame this? Lots of notes in here. WP3 Part D. The boroughs to take that away to consider the wording. Can I just leave it as that? WP Part 3 particularly. And that relates to matters for officers to consider potentially compensatory provision outside the South London Waste Plan area. Then WP3 Part A, the question is the word only necessary? Officers will consider that. And also at the same time, is there attention with WP7 Part A? So we'll look at both of them together.
Yeah, and I also picked up on WP3C. Again, it says the last sentence: sites will be safeguarded for waste uses only. So it's the use of only in both of those, both criteria A and C.
Yeah. And then there's a specific reference to dated years for a 5-year maximum throughput, just to remove those specific years as a modification we consider. Then there is the question on waste treatment definition, and officers will consider, I think, as a matter for pretty much all the site definitions when you look at all the site descriptions and in the glossary, so this matter around the term waste treatment. Then I come to the monitoring. I don't know if is there anything have I missed if I go now to monitoring?
I think the issues with monitoring we just touched upon, the ones that I've raised about the journey in terms of ensuring we delivering the vision objectives, but I think you've probably just made some quite comprehensive notes on those. No, sorry, I thought you said monitoring. That's why I just said. No, I apologize.
I've summarized all my notes
No,
that I have
that
up
was-
to monitoring.
I think you've gone through those. I think there's obviously this issue about, and it comes back into the monitoring regime and into other aspects of the plan in terms of some of the air quality issues we talked about this morning. And where do we perhaps refer to some of those? Wasn't policy specific necessarily, but we set off this morning talking about air quality. And we did talk about how we perhaps refer to some of that. And it's whether it goes in the monitoring framework or goes somewhere else, about the regimes that are involved in considering air quality that's not necessarily the plan. And again, that's not necessarily a soundness issue, but it's this issue that's been raised this morning about, well, I picked the plan up. What's the plan doing about air quality? Well, it can do some things, but it's alerting to the fact that there are other regimes in place that can deal with other matters in relation to that. So I think that was my last thing. I think you've picked up adequately the things that we raised from this morning session about WP3 and its various components and WP7 relationship that you're going to go away to have a think about. Oh, there was, well, in that thinking as well, there's the sequential approach that was raised. So I'm sure, I don't know if you'd pick that, if that's what you're referring to as well, but there is that kind of sequential approach thinking about what if then there is just isn't anything we can find, where do we go next? But yeah, I think you've picked that up, I think, Mr. James, from our discussions this morning. I do apologize. I look at you as a soundbite because when you nod your head, I think that's it. Then, yeah, you're kind of the lead spokesperson. So if you've got that one, you've got that one. I take it that you've got that one.
The other one was the whether intensification of existing sites within the plan area could be considered as compensatory provision for needs arising outside of the plan area, taking into account the discussion we had on no new sites for that purpose, but that was something to consider as well. Okay, Mr. James, you've got your Mr. van der Westhausen, if you could just summarize the monitoring ones just for completeness as well, please.
So on the monitoring, I've got to clarify the limitations of the local planning authorities monitoring regimes, and with the links to the Environment Agency. And then also draw out relationship with other plans, such as local plans. And that links into a theme potentially of a local authority existing enforcement policies, strategies. And if we can highlight that and bring that in. And then there was the point about monitoring. I found the reference, which is main mod 1.28a, which was the about the bullet point about planning permissions and compliance with conditions. For that to be potentially included as a monitoring measure. And then the broader point which Inspector Normington made, and I collected a lot of the examples, but it's monitoring the objectives I wrote down, and there's a progress on co-location, progress in circular economy. I've made a long list of them, but generally, those are the ones that I have for monitoring.
Yeah, the only other, you've probably picked them up, but there were sort of nuances on those was how the industrial land supply, general industrial land supply is monitored, and then that reference in paragraph 5 point whatever it was, where it talks about planning permissions and conditions, also referring to obligations. So that was the only other one I had. I don't know, Inspector Normington. Okay, thank you. So that concludes our discussion this afternoon. Oh, Mr. Witter, did you want to say something, sir?
Rather, industrial land supply, in practice, that won't always be something which could be reported on annually. Quite often it depends on a full review or a survey, which may only be periodic after a few years, although we can monitor industrial trends in terms of developments in our area. But for an overall review on how it's affecting the position in terms of the need for Sutton to provide industrial land and for the other 3 boroughs to retain industrial land, each year in the AMR, I just doubt whether it would always each year be feasible always to reflect the true position on that.
I wonder again whether it could be a reactive kind of monitoring on this one. I don't know what your thoughts are, Inspector Norrington, but you know, if there's been a planning permission, it's gone from waste use to general industrial, or there's some general industrial use that's gone to waste use, you know, within the monitoring period, and it's known whether that could be picked up. Does that sound reasonable?
It's nothing more complicated than periodically when there is a relevant time with other monitoring regimes that can be cross-checked against, well, where's the direction of this plan going with other plans? Because we have got those land use changes that's either adding or subtracting to capacity, and either taking industrial land out of the market or adding to it. So it's just ensuring that, and you could argue that in review of other plans, the same linkage needs to be applied as well, because it works both ways, of course. So I don't think it's a thing. I think it's primarily a reactive monitor that just needs to be periodically sense checked, so that you can address any criticism that says, well, actually, it's thwarting employment land provision, or you are under providing for waste now. So there's plenty of simple ways of doing that.
I think some of those aspects are already covered in our framework. I mean, for example, indicator 4.1 amounts lost to the amount of waste managed at compensatory sites compared to the amount of waste previously managed at the corresponding safeguarded sites, which have been lost to other uses. And there's 1 or 2 other indicators which could be used to address that point about the trends of changes of use when we lose sites to other uses, and under which circumstances. Is it just a loss, or is it a compensatory facility? That sort of, we'll try to cover that, but we'll go away and look in further detail to make sure those aspects are covered.
And that's probably a good example, because what that's monitoring indirectly, it's monitoring the waste capacity in tonnage terms lost, as opposed to land area that might be lost. So it's in there. It's in there, but it's just having to think about it probably needs to do 2 things. There's a waste capacity issue of loss, but there's also a physical land area of loss or addition that is a annual event, depending on what planning permission has been granted for whatever use, one way or the other. So it's not hard. It's yeah, I appreciate what you're saying, but I think that particular one, it's kind of focuses on waste capacity as opposed to land use, and there's kind of two different things there.
Mr. James, did you want to come in?
Yes, not on that point, just on in terms of the discussions we're going to have. Clearly, it's likely there's going to be some other modifications that we're going to propose. It was just about the timing of them and when. I mean, obviously sooner rather than later, but if there was a definitive point, because I think some of the discussions we have tomorrow might influence some of those mods, so we don't want to propose something and then having to unpick it. So it was just when you might reasonably expect to see some further modifications from us.
Certainly not before tomorrow, Mr. James. So you know, we anticipate further discussion tomorrow might actually, you know, it might flavour the sort of modifications that we're already starting to talk about. So my view is that that's something we cover in our post hearings letter.
Probably same to the discussion we had this morning. It's kind of we can be reactive and do these things, but there'll be other things come out here, and you need to think about it in the round. And you need time to do that properly, because if not, you'll suddenly find you've said something that you find out 3 weeks down the line, you need another modification now to redress what you've already done. So I think, you know, we have, I think we need to go from here, away from here with a general flavour, but not necessarily every T crossed and I dotted in that sense, because you need to think about it very, very carefully to just be sure that is it doing what we asked it to do. By doing what we're doing, does it have any effect in any other policy or aspect of the plan that indirectly we'd not thought about this effect, and just to sense check it. So we need the flavour by the end of tomorrow, not necessarily the full detail, but the flavour and the kind of areas that you're going to look at, so we understand that, yeah, that's what you're going to consider in some detail. But think about it. It's all I can say to you. Don't try and please us and suddenly find out we've got a bigger problem because we haven't really had time to think it through.
Okay, any more points before we wrap up for the afternoon? Okay, well, thank you for your contributions today. So the hearing's now closed and we'll resume tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you.